Good morning and welcome. My name is Scott Dunn, the Renegade, and today going to be doing a reading of Hp Lovecraft's Cool Air. I've been a fan of Hp Lovecraft for quite some time. Love his work, love his writing. I think it's great. So I guess we'll just start here in just a moment. I do hope you enjoy this. Cool Air by Hp Lovecraft. You ask me to explain why I am afraid of a draught of cool air, why I shiver more than others upon entering a cold room, and seem nauseated and repelled when the chill of evening creeps through the heat of midday autumn. There are those who say I respond to cold as others do a bad odor, and I am the last to deny the impression. What I will do to relate the most horrible circumstance I have encountered and leave it to you. What I will do is to relate the most horrible circumstance I have ever encountered and leave it to you to judge whether or not this forms a suitable explanation of my peculiarity. It is a mistake to fancy that horror is associated extrinably with silence, darkness, and solitude. I found it in the glare of mid-afternoon, in the clangor of a metropolis, and in the teeming midst of a shabby and commonplace rooming house with a prosaic landlady and two stalwart men by my side. In the spring of 1923, I had secured some dreary and unprofitable magazine work in the city of New York, and being unable to pay any substantial rent, began drifting from one cheap boarding establishment to another in search of a room which might combine the qualities of decent cleanliness, endurable furnishings, and very reasonable price. It soon developed that I had only a choice between different evils. But after a time, I came upon a house in West 14th Street which disgusted me much less than the others I had sampled. The place was a 4-story mansion of brownstone, dating apparently from the late 40s, and fitted with woodwork and marble, whose stained and sullied splendor argued a descent from high levels of tasteful opulence. In the rooms, large and lofty, and decorated with impossible paper and ridiculously ornate stucco cornices, there lingered a depressing mustiness and hint of obscure cookery. But the floors were clean, and the linens were regular, and the hot water was not often too cold or turned off, so that I came to regard it at last as a bearable place to hibernate until one might really live again. The landlady, a slatternly, almost bearded Spanish woman named Herreo, did not annoy me with gossip or circumstances of the late burning electric light on my third-floor front hallway room, and my fellow lodgers were as quiet and uncommunicative as one might desire, being mostly a Spaniard a little above the coarsest and crudest grade. Only the din of streetcars in the thoroughfare below created a serious annoyance. I had been there for about 3 weeks, when the first odd incident occurred. One evening, at about 8, I heard a spattering on the floor, and became suddenly aware that I had been smelling the pungent odor of ammonia for some time. Looking about, I saw that the ceiling was wet and dripping, the soaking apparently proceeding from the corner of the side towards the street. Anxious to stop this matter at its source, I hastened to the basement to tell the landlady, and was assured by her that the trouble would be quickly set right. "Dr. Munoz," she cried, as she rushed upstairs ahead of me. "He have spilled his chemicals. He is to seek for doctor himself, seeker and seeker all the time. But he not will at all to help others. He is very queer in his sickness. All day he take funny-smelling baths, and he cannot get excite or warm. All his own housework he do. His little room are full little bottles, and you do not work as doctor. But he was great once. My father in Barcelona have hear of him, and only just now he fix his arm of the plunger, and get hurt of sudden. He never go out, only on roof, and my boy Esteban, he bring him his food and laundry and medicines and chemicals. My God, the sal amniotic that man uses to keep him cool." Miss Herreo disappeared up the staircase to the 4th floor, and I returned to my room. The ammonia ceased to drip, and I cleaned up what had spilled and opened the window for air. I heard the landlady's heavy footsteps above me. Dr. Munoz I had never heard, save for certain sounds of some gasoline-driven mechanism, since his step was soft and gentle. I wondered for a moment what the strange affliction this man might have is, and whether his obstinate refusal of outside aid were not the result of a rather baseless eccentricity. There is, I reflected tritely, an infinite deal of pathos in the state of an eminent person who has come down in the world. I might never have known Dr. Munoz had it not been for the heart attack that suddenly seized me one forenoon as I sat writing in my room. Physicians had told me the danger of those spells, and I knew there was no time to be lost. So remembering what the landlady had said about the invalid's help of the injured workmen, I dragged myself upstairs and knocked feebly at the door above mine. My knock was answered in good English by a curious voice, at some distance to the right, asking my name and business, and these things being stated, there came the opening of the door next to the one I had sought. A rush of cool air greeted me, and though the day was one of the hottest in June, I shivered as I crossed the threshold into the large apartments whose richness and tasteful decor surprised me in this nest of squalor and seediness. A folding couch now filled its duel of a sofa, and the mahogany furniture, sumptuous hangings, old paintings, and mellow bookshelves all bespoke a gentleman's study rather than a boarding-house's bedroom. I now saw the hall room above mine, the lethal room of bottles and machines which Miss Hero had mentioned, was merely the laboratory of the doctor, and that his main living quarters lay in the spacious adjoining room whose convenient alcoves and large contiguous bathroom permitted him to hide all dressers and obtrusive utilitarian devices. Dr. Munoz, most certainly, was a man of birth, cultivation, and discrimination. The figure before me was short but exquisitely proportioned, and clad in somewhat formal dress of a perfect cut and fit. A high-bred face of masterful, though not arrogant expression, was adorned by a short, iron-grey full beard, and an old-fashioned pince-nez shielded the full, dark eyes, and surmounted the aquiline nose, which gave a Moorish touch to Fibonacci, otherwise dominantly Ciltribian. Thick, well-trimmed hair that argued the punctual calls of a barber was parted gracefully above a high forehead, and the whole picture was one of striking intelligence and superior brood and breeding. Nevertheless, I saw Dr. Munoz in that blast of cool air. I felt a repugnance which nothing in his aspect could justify. Only his lividly inclined complexion and coldness of touch could have afforded a physical basis for this feeling, and even these things should have been excusable considering the man's known invalidism. It might, too, have been the singular cold that alienated me, for such chilliness was abnormal on so hot day, and the abnormal always excites aversion, distrust, and fear. But repugnance was soon forgotten in admiration, for the strange physician's extreme skills at once became manifest despite the ice-coldness and shakiness of his bloodless-looking hands. He clearly understood my needs at a glance, and ministered to them with the master's deftness, the while reassuring me in finely modulated, though oddly hollow and timbreless voice, that he was the bitterest of sworn enemies to death, and had sunk his fortune and lost all his friends in a lifetime of bizarre experiments devoted to its bafflement and extravagance. Something of the benevolent fanatic seemed to reside within him, and he rambled on almost garrulously as he sounded my chest and mixed a suitable draught of drugs fetched from a small laboratory room. Evidently, he found the society of a well-born man a rare novelty in this dingy environment, and was moved to unaccustomed speech as memories of his better days surged over him. His voice, if queer, was at least soothing, and I could not even perceive that he breathed as the fluent sentences rolled urbanely out. He sought to distract my mind from my own seizure by speaking of his theories and experiments, and I remember his tactful counseling of me about my weak heart by insisting that will and consciousness are stronger than organic life itself, so that, if a bodily frame be originally healthy and carefully preserved, it may, through a scientific enhancement of these qualities, retain a kind of nervous animation despite the most serious impairments, defects, or even absences in the battery of specific organs. He might, he half-jestingly said, some day teach me to live, or at least possess some kind of conscious existence, without any art at all. For his part, he was afflicted with a complication of maladies requiring a very exact regimen, which included constant cold. Any marked rise in the temperature might, if prolonged, affect him fatally, and the frigidity of his habitation, some 55 or 56 degrees Fahrenheit, was maintained by the absorption system of ammonia cooling, the gasoline engines of whose pumps I had often heard in my room below. Relieved of my seizure, in a marvelous short while, I left the shivery place, a disciple and devotee of this gifted recluse. After that, I paid him frequent overcoded calls, listening while he told me of secret researches, and almost ghastly results, and trembling a bit when I examined the unconventional and astonishingly ancient volumes on his shelves. I was eventually, I may add, almost cured of my disease for all time by his skillful ministrations. It seemed that he did not scorn the incantations of the medievalists, since he believed those cryptic formulae to contain rare psychological stimuli, which might conceivably have singular effects on the substance of the nervous system from which the organic postulations had fled. I was touched by his account of aged Dr. Torres of Valencia, who had shared his earlier experimentations with him through great illness of 18 years before, whence his present disorders proceeded. No sooner had the venerable practitioner saved his colleague than he himself succumbed to the grim enemy that he fought. Perhaps the strain had been too great, for Dr. Munoz made it whisperingly clear, though not in detail, that the methods of healing had been most extraordinary, involving scenes and processes not welcomed by the elderly and conserves of Galen. As the weeks passed, I observed with regret that my new friend was slowly but unmistakably losing ground physically, as Miss Hero had suggested. The livid aspect of his countenance was intensified, his voice became more hollow and indistinct, his muscular motions were less perfectly coordinated, and his mind and will displayed less resilience and initiative. Of these sad changes he seemed by no means unaware, and little by little his expression and conversation took on a gruesome irony, which restored in me something of a subtle repulsion I had originally felt. He developed strange caprices, acquiring a fondness for exotic spices and Egyptian incense till his room smelled like the vault of a sepultured pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings. At the same time, his demands for cold air increased, and with my aid he amplified the ammonia piping of his room, and modified the pumps and feeds of his refrigeration machine till he could keep the temperature as low as 34 or 40, and finally 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The bathroom and laboratory, of course, being less chilled, in order that water might not freeze and the chemical process may not be impeded. The tenant adjoining him complained of the icy air from around the connecting door, so I helped him fit heavy hangings to obviate the difficulty. My mistake there. A kind of growing horror of outre and morbid caste seemed to possess him. He talked of death incessantly, but laughed hollowly when such things as burial or funeral arrangements were gently suggested. All in all, he became disconcerting, and even gruesome. He became a disconcerting and even gruesome companion. Yet in my gratitude for his healing, I could not well abandon him to the strangers around him, and I was careful to dust his room and attend to his needs each day, muffled in a heavy ulster which I brought especially for his purpose. I likewise did much of the shopping, and gasped in bafflement at some of the chemicals he ordered from the druggists and laboratory supply houses. An increasing and unexplained atmosphere of panic seemed to rise around his apartment. The whole house, as I have said, had a musty odor, but the smell in his room was worse. In spite of all the spices and incenses and the pungent chemicals of the now incessant baths which he insisted on taking unaided, I perceived that it must be connected to his ailment, and shuddered when I reflected on him what his ailment might be. Miss Harrow crossed herself when she looked at him, and gave him up unreservedly to me, not even letting her son Esteban continuing to run errands for him. When I suggested other physicians, the sufferer would fly into such much of a rage as he seemed to dare entertain. He evidently feared the physical effort of violent emotion, yet his will and driving force waxed rather than waned, and he refused to be confined to bed. The lassitude of his earlier ill days gave place to a return of his fiery purpose, so that he seemed to hurl defiance at Death Daemon, even as that ancient enemy seized him. The pretense of eating, always curiously like a formality with him, he virtually abandoned, and mental power alone seemed to keep him from total collapse. He acquired a habit of writing long documents of some sort, which he carefully sealed and filled with injunctions that I transmit after his death to certain persons whom he named, for the most parted lettered East Indians, but including a once celebrated French physician now generally thought dead, and about whom most inconceivable things had been whispered. As it happened, I burned all these papers, undelivered and unopened. His aspect and voice became utterly frightful, and his presence almost unbearable. One September day, an unexpected glimpse of him induced an epileptic fit in a man who had come to repair his electric desk lamp, a fit for which he prescribed effectively while keeping well out of sight. That man, oddly enough, had been through the terrors of the Great War without having incurred any fright so thorough. Then, in the middle October, the horror of horrors came with stupefying suddenness. One night, about 11, the pump of the refrigerating machine broke down, so that within 3 hours the process of ammonia cooling became impossible. Dr. Munoz summoned me by thumping on the floor, and I worked desperately to repair the injury, while my host cursed in a tone whose lifeless hollowness surpassed description. My amateur efforts, however, proved of no use, and when I had brought the mechanic from the neighboring all-night garage, we learned that nothing could be done till morning, when a new piston would have to be obtained. The moribund hermit's rage and fear swelled to grotesque proportions, seemed to likely shatter what remained of his failing physique, and once a spasm caused him to clap his hands to his eyes and rush to the bathroom. He groped his way out with his face tightly bandaged, and I never saw his eyes again. The frigidity of his apartment was now sensibly diminishing, and at about 5 a.m. the doctor retired to the bathroom, commanding me to keep him supplied with all the ice I could obtain at an all-night drugstore or cafeteria. As I would return from my sometimes discouraging trips and lay the spoils before the closed bathroom door, I could hear the restless splashing within, and a thick voice croaking out for the order of more, more. At length, a warm day broke, and the shops opened one by one. I asked Esteban either to help with the ice fetching whilst I obtained the pump piston, or to order the pump piston while I continued with the ice, but instructed by his mother, he absolutely refused. Finally, I hired a seedy-looking loafer whom I encountered upon the corner of 8th Avenue, to keep the patient supplied with ice from the little shop where I introduced him, and applied myself diligently to finding the pump piston and engaging workmen competently to install it. The task seemed interminable, and I raged almost as violently as the hermit when I saw the hours slipping by in a breathless, foodless round of vain telephoning and a hectic quest from place to place hither and thither by subway and surface car. About noon I encountered a suitable supply house far downtown, and at approximately 1:30 p.m. arrived at the boarding place, with the necessary paraphernalia and 2 sturdy, intelligent mechanics. I had done all I could, and I hoped I was in time. Black terror, however, had preceded me. The house was in utter turmoil, and above the chatter of odd voices I heard a man praying in a deep basso. Fiendish things were in the air, and lodgers told over the beads of their rosaries as they caught the odor from beneath the doctor's closed door. The lounger I had hired, it seems, had fled, screaming and mad-eyed, not long after his second delivery of ice. Perhaps a result of excessive curiosity? He could not, of course, have locked the door behind him. Yet it was now fastened, presumably from the inside. There was no sound from within, save a nameless sort of slow, thick dripping. Briefly consulting with Miss Herrio and the workmen, despite a fear that gnashed at my inmost soul, I advised the breaking down of the door, but the landlady found a way to turn the key from the outside with some wire device. We had previously opened the doors of all the other rooms in the hall, and flung the windows to the very top, open to the very top. Now, noses protected by handkerchiefs, we tremblingly invaded the accursed south room which blazed with the warm sun of early afternoon. A kind of dark, slimy trail led from the open bathroom door to the hall door, and thence to the desk, where a terrible little pool had accumulated. Something was scrawled in the paper, something was scrawled in pencil, in awful, blind hand, on a piece of paper, hideously smeared, as though by the very claws that traced the hurried last words. Then the trail led to the couch, and ended unutterably. What was, or had been on the couch, I cannot and dare not say here. But this is what I shiveringly puzzled out on the stickily smeared paper before I drew a match and burned it to a crisp. What I puzzled out in terror as the landlady and two mechanics rushed frantically from that hellish place to babble their incoherent stories to the nearest police station. The nauseous words seemed well nigh incredible in that yellow sunlight, with the clatter of cars and motor trucks ascending clamorously from crowded 14th Street. Yet I confess that I believed them then. Whether I believe them now, I honestly don't know. There are things about which it is better not to speculate, and all that I can say is that I hate the smell of ammonia, and grow faint at a draught of unusually cool air. The end, ran the noisome scrawl, is here. No more ice. The man looked and ran away. Warmer every minute, and the tissues cannot last. I fancy you know what I said about the will and the nerves and the preserved body after the organs ceased to work. It was a good theory, but it couldn't keep up indefinitely. There was a gradual deterioration I had not foreseen. Dr. Torres knew, but the shock killed him. He could not stand what he had to do. He had to get me in a strange dark place when he minded my letter and nursed me back, and the organs would never work again. It had to be done this way. Artificial preservation. For you see, I had died that time 18 years ago. Once again, that was Cool Air, written by Hp Lovecraft. I have a whole collection of his stories here. I think I might pick another one, just to another simple one that I can go with. That'd be nice. Hezzy bum. Cat's meowing at me. Sitting here listening nicely. I think he likes this. So let's find another one to do. Let's do a classic. Oop. Let's add to this one. Okay, let's do another one. Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was a few months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger, a danger widespread and all-embracing, such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in the dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces that were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood, and looked like a pharaoh. The Fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet not say why. He said he had risen out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal, and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmares. Never before had the screams of nightmares been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on green waters, gliding under bridges and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great and old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him, and of the impelling fascinations and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said that they were horrible and impressive beyond most fervent images, that what was thrown on a screen in a darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophesy, and that in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet only shewed in his eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others not saw. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, though the stifling night, and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on the screen I saw hooded forms amidst ruins, and yellow faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against waves of destructions from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood on end while shadows more grotesque than I came to tell out and squatted on heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out, into the dizzy stairs, into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, and that I could not be afraid. The others screamed with me for solace. We swore to one another and that the city was exactly the same and still alive. And when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed our company over and over and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary formations, and seemed not to know our destinations, though we dare not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement, and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to shew where the tramways had run. And again we saw the tramcar alone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in different directions. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with the laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked towards the open country, and presently we felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn, for as we stalked out into the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows. Trackless, inexplicable snows swept asunder in one direction only, where lie a gulf all the blacker for its glistening walls. The column seemed very thin indeed, as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished, but my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screaming, sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow, writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirl blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creations, corpses of dead worlds with sores that were cities, charred winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the worlds, vague ghosts and monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest upon nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzying vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe and the muffled, maddening beats of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrious, ultimate god, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep. A personal favorite of mine there. Nyarlathotep by Hp Lovecraft. Just pardon me a moment here, the cat's whining. I'm just going to go and take care of him. What is it? Ezio, you're fine. You know what? I'm going to do this for both of you. You have to promise to relax. Okay? Treats. Gotta want a cookie? For you. A couple for you. Okay. Good. There you are. Let's do one more story that I've got here. Hang on. I should read Herbert West Reanimator one day. That'd be a nice one. Let's see now. If anyone is curious, I am reading these stories from the Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. I'm just going to link it up here. If you'd like to get a copy yourself. Yeah. That's the one I have there. Serve me well. Kind of has this ragged edging to the page. It's a little odd. I always thought that's kind of a weird look to it, you know. I don't think that's really necessary, but it's okay. It's a nice little touch, I guess. Let's see here now. Yeah, let's do one more. Dagon by Hp Lovecraft. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no more. I shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think that from my slavery to morphine I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I have the forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequent parts of the broad Pacific, that the packet of which It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize. Whilst we knew of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone on a small boat, with water and provisions for good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and uncounted for days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship, or to be cast on the shores of some habitable island. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon heaving vastness of the unbroken blue. The change happened while I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which expanded about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distant way. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at such a prodigious and unexpected transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and the rotting soil. For there was in the air and in the rotting of soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. I need to slow down. The region was putrid, with the carcasses of decaying fish and other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from the sky, which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had laid hidden underneath the unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land that had risen beneath me, I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade in the sun, as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness, and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and perhaps rescue. On the third morning I found dry soil enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of fish was maddening, but I was too concerned with far graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a far-away hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled towards that hummock, though the object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared in the distance. An intervening valley set it out in a sharper relief from the general surface, and to where to ascend I slept in the shadow of the hill. I do not know why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning of fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down upon the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over into the rim of fathomless chaos of eternal night. Though my terror ran curiously reminiscent of Paradise Lost and Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher, I began to see the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, for declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood upon the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All of my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of the distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in the abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist or archaeological delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near its zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steps that hemmed the chasm, and revealed the fact that the far-flung bottom of water flowed at the far-flung body of the water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, almost lapping at my feet as I stood upon the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed at the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphs unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fish, eel, octopi, crustacean, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things, which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of its enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs, whose subjects would have excite the envy of Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shewn disproportionate like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond imaginations of Poe or Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outlines, despite webbed hands and feet. Shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other featureless pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenario background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale represented as but a little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond conception of most daring anthropologists, I stood musing while the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then I saw it. With only slight churning to mark its rise on the surface, the thing that slid into view above the dark waters, vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its giant scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measuring sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached my boat, and at any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of an American ship that had picked my boat up in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon such a thing that I knew I could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist, and amused him with the peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon, perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all. Having written a full account of my information of the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men, often I ask myself if it could not have all been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-o'-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may be at this very moment crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likeness on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as if some immense body is lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand. The window. The window. It's a Dagon by Hp Lovecraft. Hope everyone's been enjoying this so far today. I've been enjoying it as well. I'm going to take a break here. I know it's only been an hour. I'm probably going to do something else, but I'm going to stop streaming at this time and do a bit more later on just to cut this up and let people... I may grab a drink. I need water. I need more water right now. We'll be back in a bit.